The Wife, a novel by Meg Wolitzer. This book is read by Dawn Harvey. For Eileen Young. Chapter 1. The moment I decided to leave him, the moment I thought, enough, we were 35,000 feet above the ocean, hurtling forward but giving the illusion of stillness and tranquility. Just like our marriage, I could have said, but why ruin everything right now? Here we were in first-class splendor, tentatively separated from anxiety. There was no turbulence, and the sky was bright, and somewhere among us, possibly, sat an air marshal in dull traveler's disguise, perhaps picking at a little dish of oily nuts or captivated by the zombie prose of the in-flight magazine. Drinks had already been served before takeoff, and we were both frankly bombed, our mouths half open, our heads tipped back. Women in uniform carried baskets up and down the aisles like a sexualized fleet of Red Riding Hoods. "Will you have some cookies, Mr. Castleman?" a brunette asked him, leaning over with a pair of tongs, and as her breast slid forward and then withdrew, I could see the ancient mechanism of arousal start to whir like a knife sharpener inside him, a sight I've witnessed thousands of times over all these decades. "Mrs. Castleman?" the woman asked me then, in afterthought, but I declined. I didn't want her cookies or anything else. We were on our way to the end of the marriage, heading toward the moment when I would finally get to yank the two-pronged plug from its holes, to turn away from the husband I'd lived with year after year. We were on our way to Helsinki, Finland, a place no one ever thinks about unless they're listening to Sibelius or lying on the hot, wet slats of a sauna, or eating a bowl of reindeer. Cookies had been distributed, drinks decanted, and all around me video screens had been arched and tilted. No one on this plane was fixated on death right now, the way we'd all been earlier when, wrapped in the trauma of the roar and the fuel stink and the distant braying chorus of furies trapped inside the engines, an entire planeload of minds, economy, business class, and the chosen few, came together as one and urged this plane into the air like an audience willing a psychic spoon to bend. Of course, that spoon bent every single time, its tip drooping down like some top-heavy tulip. And though airplanes didn't lift every single time, tonight this one did. Mothers handed out activity books and little plastic bags of Cheerios with dusty sediment at the bottom. Businessmen opened laptops and waited for the stuttering screens to settle. If he was on board, the Phantom Air Marshal ate and stretched and adjusted his gun beneath a staticky little square of Dynel blanket, and our plane rose in the sky until it hung suspended at the desired altitude. And finally I decided for certain that I would leave my husband. Definitely. For sure. 100%. Our 3 children were gone, 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 and there would be no changing my mind, no chickening out. He looked over at me suddenly, watched my face, and said, "What's the matter? You look a little... something." "No, it's nothing," I told him. "Nothing worth talking about now, anyway." And he accepted this as a good enough answer, returning to his plate of Toll House cookies, a small belch puffing his cheeks out frog-like briefly. It was difficult to disturb this man. He had everything he could possibly ever need. He was Joseph Castleman, one of those men who own the world. You know the type I mean. Those advertisements for themselves, those sleepwalking giants roaming the earth and knocking over other men, women, furniture, villages. Why should they care? They own everything. The seas and mountains, the quivering volcanoes, the dainty, ruffling rivers. There are many varieties of this kind of man. Joe was the writer version, a short, wound-up, slack-bellied novelist who almost never slept, who loved to consume runny cheeses and whiskey and wine, all of which he used as a vessel to carry the pills that kept his blood lipids from congealing like yesterday's pan drippings, who was as entertaining as anyone I have ever known. who had no idea of how to take care of himself or anyone else, and who derived much of his style from the Dylan Thomas Handbook of Personal Hygiene and Etiquette. There he sat beside me on Finnair Flight 702, and whenever the brunette brought him something, he took it from her. Every single cookie and smokehouse-treated nut and pair of spongy throwaway slippers and steaming washcloth rolled Tora tight. If that luscious cookie woman had stripped to her waist and offered him one of her breasts, mashing the nipple into his mouth with the assured authority of La Leche Commandant, he would have taken it. No questions asked. As a rule, the men who own the world are hyperactively sexual, though not necessarily with their wives. Back in the 1960s, Joe and I leapt into beds all the time, occasionally even during a lull at cocktail parties, barricading someone's bedroom door and then climbing a mountain of coats. People would come banging, wanting their coats back, and we'd laugh and shush each other and try to zip up and tuck in before letting them enter. We hadn't had that in a long time, though if you'd seen us here on this airplane heading for Finland, you'd have assumed we were content, that we still touched each other's sluggish body parts at night. "Listen, you want an extra pillow?" he asked me. "No, I hate those doll pillows," I said. "Oh, and don't forget to stretch your legs like Dr. Krentz said." You'd look at us, Joan and Joe Castleman of Weathermill, New York, and currently seats 3A and 3B, and you'd know exactly why we were traveling to Finland. You might even envy us, him for all the power vacuum packed within his bulky shop-worn body, and me for my 24-hour access to it, as though a famous and brilliant writer husband is a convenience store for his wife, a place she can dip into any time for a big gulp of astonishing intellect and wit and excitement. People usually thought we were a good couple, and I suppose that once a long, long time ago, back when the cave paintings were first sketched on the rough walls at Lascaux, back when the earth was uncharted and everything seemed hopeful, this was true. But soon enough we moved from the glory and self-love of any young couple to the green algae swamp of what is delicately known as later life. Though I'm now 64 years old and mostly as invisible to men as a swirl of dust motes, I used to be a slender, big-titted blonde girl with a certain shyness that drew Joe toward me like a hypnotized chicken. I don't flatter myself. Joe was always drawn to women, all kinds of them, right from the moment he entered the world in 1930 via the wind tunnel of his mother's birth canal. Lorna Castleman, the mother-in-law I never met, was overweight, sentimentally poetic and possessive, loving her son with a lover's exclusivity. Some of the men who own the world, on the other hand, were ignored throughout their childhoods, left sandwichless at lunchtime in bleak schoolyards. Lorna not only loved him, but so did her two sisters who shared their Brooklyn apartment, along with Joe's grandmother Mims, a woman built like a footstool, whose claim to fame was that she made a mean brisket. His father, Martin, a perpetually sighing and ineffectual man, died of a heart attack at his shoe store when Joe was 7, leaving him a captive of this peculiar womanly civilization. It was typical, the way they told him his father was dead. Joe had just come home from school and, finding the apartment unlocked, he let himself in. No one else was home, which was unusual for a household that always seemed to contain some woman or other, hunched and busy as a wood sprite. Joe sat down at the kitchen table and ate his afternoon snack of yellow sponge cake in the moony, stupefied way that children have, a constellation of crumbs on the lips and chin. Soon the door to the apartment swung open again, and the women piled in. Joe heard crying, the emphatic blowing of noses, and then they appeared in the kitchen, crowding around the table. Their faces were inflamed, their eyes bloodshot, their carefully constructed hairdos destroyed. Something big.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?